History rarely preserves the nights when a ruler's grief becomes more dangerous than any invading army. Yet in 983 CE, inside the fading power of the Buyid dynasty, one decision sign behind locked doors and trembling lamps would scar an entire city. This is the buried account of the night. A real prince, Samsam al-Dawla, allowed fear to eclipse judgment, turning ancient cruelty into written law. What follows is not legend, but the unsettling reconstruction of a truth history tried to forget. In 983 CE, when Samsam al-Dawla ascended to the Buyid throne of Fars in Iraq, his inheritance was less a kingdom than a patchwork of exhausted loyalties. The death of his father, Adud al-Dawla, left behind a legacy of military expansion, but also a delicate political anatomy held together by personal authority rather than institutional strength. Once that authority vanished, rival commanders encircled the young heir like wolves testing a wounded animal. To chroniclers of the era, Samsam's rule began not with coronation but with suspicion. Every handshake hid a calculation. Every bowed head masked a judgment of whether the young prince could hold together the world his father had built. The Buyid military elite, largely Dalamite commanders hardened by decades of war, regarded Samsam as untested, educated, refined, but emotionally unsettled. He sensed their doubts in every council meeting. It was in these early months that his anxieties began to bloom into something darker. The more he tried to emulate his father's decisiveness, the more the army's senior officers exchanged glances behind him, silently measuring the gap between the former ruler's iron will and the son's unsteady composure. Their skepticism became the first seed of the paranoia that would later define his reign. But it was Samsam's private curiosities that unsettled the court scribes most. Unlike his father, who had adopted Islamic legal principles with measured consistency, Samsam drifted frequently into the past, asking scholars about penal codes from pre-Islamic Persia, requesting translations of surviving Sasanian guidelines for public discipline, and studying accounts of rulers who used punishment not merely to correct wrongdoing, but to intimidate populations. These interests were not illegal, nor even uncommon among intellectuals of the time, yet the intensity with which he pursued them raised concern in a fragile political climate. What worried his advisors was not what he read, but why. They observed that he gravitated toward stories where rulers commanded obedience through fear, rather than loyalty tales of monarchs who imposed ordeals of pain to extract truth, legends of tribunals where silence was treated as guilt. Whenever the council pressed him for decisions on taxation, troop assignments, or diplomatic tensions, his attention drifted, as though he were contemplating something far removed from the pressing issues of governance. What his father viewed as moral excesses, Samsam saw as instruments of clarity, ancient tools capable of cutting through deceit and uncertainty. His fascination remained private, yet it intensified as resistance to his authority grew. Each regional commander who postponed delivering taxes, each noble who hesitated to pledge allegiance, seemed to confirm a growing belief inside him that traditional governance lacked the means to enforce certainty. Chroniclers later wrote that Samsam's early months were filled not with ambition, but with an unspoken dread, an internal terror that he might be remembered as the weak link that unraveled a dynasty. The throne he inherited was already fractured, but his fear of losing it would create deeper fissures. As rumors of factional disputes multiplied and whispers spread through the palace corridors, Samsam's survival instincts hardened. And in that pressure, the seeds of his future decision, the darkest decree of his rule, quietly took root. The palace gardens of Shiraz were ordinarily a refuge from the tensions of rule. An enclosed world of citrus trees, still fountains, and narrow pathways where only trusted attendants walked. But in the early months of Samsam al-Dawla's reign, that sanctuary became the setting of an event so destabilizing that chroniclers later marked it as the moment the Buyid court lost its balance. His younger sister, a quiet presence seldom mentioned in official records, was found lifeless near the stables one dawn. Though the scribes preserved few details, they agreed on one point: her condition made clear that her death was not natural. The shock spread quickly through the palace. Servants ran in hushed chaos, trying to determine who had discovered her, who had been near the gardens, and how a member of the ruling family could be harmed inside the most guarded section of the estate. The guards responsible for the night watch were immediately detained. The stable workers were questioned in the presence of trembling commanders, yet within hours, inconsistencies infected every testimony. One guard swore he had seen her hours earlier near the fountain. Another insisted he heard nothing at all. A groom claimed the palace lights flickered unusually during the night, while a kitchen servant swore she heard muffled arguing from a corridor. None of the accounts aligned. For Samsam al-Dawla, the news was a wound without bandage. His sister had been one of the few individuals who interacted with him without political calculation. She offered no counsel on governance, sought no favors, and held no ambitions. Her presence was a reminder of childhood, a fragile connection to a time before authority transformed every relationship into a negotiation. When her body was brought to a guarded chamber inside the palace, witnesses recorded that he stood for a long time without speaking, his expression subdued, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Rumors erupted almost instantly. Some whispered that a rival Buid faction had sent an assassin to strike at Samsam's emotional core. Others suggested that a disgruntled commander, one who believed Samsam unfit to rule, had orchestrated the tragedy to provoke instability that could be used against him. A few, more cautious, believed the death might have been the result of a personal dispute unrelated to politics. But none said these theories aloud in front of the ruler. They knew grief could transform into suspicion, and suspicion into retaliation. The council attempted to speak gently to Samsam during the first hours of mourning. They urged patience, careful inquiry, and adherence to established legal procedure. These words, though well-intended, struck him as distant and insufficient. To him, the tone of their advice suggested detachment, even hesitance, an unwillingness to pursue justice with the urgency he demanded. Their calls for due process seemed like thinly veiled resistance. He interpreted every pause, every lowered gaze, every soft suggestion as proof that some among them were hiding the truth, possibly even shielding the culprit. As the day turned to night, the palace atmosphere thickened with dread. Soldiers patrolled the corridors more aggressively than usual, and attendants avoided crossing paths with anyone who looked distraught or suspicious. Shiraz had endured political turmoil before, but never had the ruling family been struck within its own private refuge. In that single night, Samsam's grief sharpened into a conviction. Someone inside his court had betrayed him. And once that belief settled into his mind, the path toward harsher judgment began its slow, irreversible formation. In the days that followed his sister's death, the Buid court moved as though every sound might trigger an unseen collapse. Samsam al-Dawla summoned his council repeatedly, sometimes at midday, sometimes without warning late at night, demanding updates from investigators who had nothing new to offer. Each meeting opened with his expectation of revelation and ended in a suffocating quiet, as officials exchanged uneasy glances, unwilling to declare innocence or suspicion without evidence. Their silence, meant to keep the situation controlled, instead convinced Samsam that they were concealing truths from him. In one assembly hall session, beneath carved stucco arches still bearing remnants of Sasanian motifs, he pressed the chief Qadi to authorize extraordinary investigative measures. The man hesitated, citing the norms of Islamic jurisprudence and the oath he had taken to preserve it. His refusal was firm but respectful. It was also, to Samsam, an unmistakable sign of defiance. The council's attempt to ground the investigation in legal tradition felt like a deliberate obstruction at a moment when he believed only uncompromising action could expose the culprit. What stung Samsam most was their demeanor. They addressed him with courtesy, but their restraint felt like caution born of fear. Not loyalty, not trust, but the instinct to protect themselves from the consequences of his grief. He had expected his anguish to galvanize them. Instead, they offered procedural language and restrained gestures. To a ruler already doubting the loyalty of those around him, their composure looked dangerously close to indifference. With each meeting, he grew convinced the council intended to dilute the inquiry until it dissolved into nothing. When he confronted them with his suspicion that the murderer might be within the palace, the ministers avoided eye contact. That avoidance, a typical response to prevent offense, became in his mind an admission of guilt or, at the very least, complacency. And as he remembered the guards' inconsistent testimonies from the morning of the discovery, his frustration deepened into a grim certainty. Someone was lying, and the existing laws were too fragile to uncover who. It was then that Sam turned inward, withdrawing to his father's old library. Lantern light flickered across shelves of legal commentaries, medical treatises, and histories of ancient rule. He sought not comfort but instruction. Chroniclers later noted that he spent long nights reading passages about pre-Islamic judicial systems, especially those of the Sasanian Empire, whose rulers had sometimes used coercion to extract confessions in matters deemed vital to state security. While many of those customs had been abandoned centuries earlier, they offered something the current system did not: certainty through pressure, clarity through endurance, truth forced rather than found. Sam read slowly, deliberately, absorbing not only the methods but the justifications. Ancient rulers had believed that the stability of the realm outweighed individual suffering, that extracting truth preserved the many at the cost of the few. In his numb grief, these arguments did not disturb him, they comforted him. They offered a path forward, a framework for action that bypassed the counsel he no longer trusted. When he emerged from the library the next morning, the change was subtle but unmistakable. His questions grew pointed, his patience thinned. His tone hardened. The council noticed immediately, but no one dared confront the growing shadow behind his words. Their silence, meant to protect the realm, only pushed him further toward a conclusion he had already begun to embrace. If truth would not emerge willingly, then it must be taken. No official summons was issued, no guards were rearranged in formation. It began instead with a quiet order delivered to a handful of loyal Dalamite soldiers, a request to bring several palace workers to a secluded chamber near the archives. These were individuals whose names had surfaced repeatedly in inconsistent accounts of his sister's spinal movements: a young stable assistant, an elderly groundskeeper, 2 guards from the eastern gate. None had been formally accused. None understood why they were being taken, but the silence of the escorts made the intent unmistakably grave. The chamber chosen for their questioning was one rarely used, its walls thick enough to muffle sound, and its windows positioned too high to permit escape. A single oil lamp cast an unsteady glow across the floor. The workers arrived confused, some trembling, others rehearsing fragments of explanations. Until that night, they had been ordinary servants, familiar with the rhythms of palace life, confident that legal order, whatever its imperfections, still guarded them. They did not yet understand that Sam's grief had unsettled those safeguards. When he entered the room, he did not shout or accuse. He simply observed them in silence, studying their faces as though comparing them to the scattered testimonies he had collected. He asked questions gently at first: who saw his sister, when they last heard her voice, whether they noticed anyone unfamiliar near the gardens. Their answers wavered under his scrutiny. One worker contradicted a detail he had given days earlier. Another stumbled over a timeline she had previously stated with certainty. To Sam, these deviations were not signs of fear, but evidence of deception. The chief investigator, bound by law, had refused to authorize any coercive method earlier that day. Sam interpreted the refusal as abandonment. And so, without witnesses from the judiciary, he gave a quiet nod to the Dalamite soldiers. It was an instruction, unspoken in words, yet perfectly understood. The soldiers stepped forward, their presence filling the chamber with an oppressive finality. The tone of the interrogation changed. Pressure, not physical harm at first, but the unmistakable threat of it, crept into the questions. As the workers' voices cracked, as their fear shifted from confusion to desperation, contradictions multiplied. Each person, seeking safety, offered new details that could not all be true. Their stories branched into conflicting paths, none aligning with the last. To Sam, their inconsistency proved guilt. In reality, it reflected the panic of individuals trapped in a room where the ordinary laws of the palace no longer applied. Hours passed. The lamp burned low. The chamber's air grew thick with dread. No definitive answer emerged, yet Sam left convinced that withholding the full range of necessary measures had obscured the truth. His final look at the workers, broken, terrified, pleading for clarity, was not one of cruelty but of grim resolve. He believed, fully, that only stronger methods could uncover what had happened to his sister. That night marked the first fracture in the legal foundations he was meant to preserve. It was unofficial, undocumented, witnessed only by soldiers who knew better than to speak. But its consequence was irreversible. Sam had found a path he believed more effective than the law he inherited. And he would walk it again. The morning Sam al-Dawla summoned his legal scholars, many assumed it would be another frustrated appeal for clarity. Rumors of the vanished palace workers had spread quietly, never openly discussed, yet omnipresent in every corridor. The scholars, many elderly and deeply rooted in jurisprudence, arrived hoping to guide their ruler back toward the stability of precedent. But the moment they stepped into the council chamber and saw soldiers flanking the walls, they understood the conversation would be far from academic. Sam opened the meeting with a calmness that unsettled everyone present. He described the inconsistencies in witness accounts, the silence of palace staff, the resistance of judges who had cited legal boundaries he now found obstructive. He presented a new demand, a formal decree permitting coercive interrogation in treason cases. He stated it plainly, without pretense, as though proposing a minor amendment to taxation protocols. His voice remained steady, but his eyes carried the dull exhaustion of a man who had replaced grief with purpose. Several scholars exchanged glances. One attempted a gentle reminder that Islamic jurisprudence prohibited harm during inquiry except under narrowly defined circumstances, and even then, only with judicial oversight. Sam listened, expression unchanged, as though the reminder were irrelevant to the crisis before him. He then produced scrolls of Sasanian-era legal commentaries taken from his father's library, ancient texts describing pre-Islamic methods of extracting confessions in cases threatening state stability. He requested that the scholars reinterpret these passages into a usable policy, compatible with current law yet strong enough to pierce through what he called the palace fog of deception. The request was not phrased as an order, but the soldiers' presence made refusal perilous. A tense silence followed. One scholar slowly closed his inkpot, as if stalling for time. Another bowed his head, whispering a prayer. That night, several scholars slipped out of the city through secondary gates, leaving behind their positions, belongings, and reputations. Their departure was quiet but conspicuous, and the city's bureaucracy interpreted it as a warning. Even those closest to the law were fleeing the ruler they once advised. Those who remained were divided. Some argued for moderation, suggesting procedural safeguards or temporary clauses. Others, younger and more politically vulnerable, aligned themselves with Sam, driven not by conviction but by the increasing fear permeating the palace. They began drafting, reluctantly but efficiently, a framework for extraordinary interrogation when treason threatened state survival. As drafts circulated, clerks and scribes noticed subtle but undeniable changes in tone within the palace. Conversation shortened. Doors closed more quickly. Senior officials accepted mandates without debate. The news of the missing workers, whispered from servant to servant, lingered as a silent justification for compliance. Fear not loyalty became the primary force binding the administration. Sam interpreted the scholars' output as progress. Their revisions, couched in legal phrasing, gave his intentions a veneer of legitimacy. He thanked them with restrained politeness, but the scholars noted his detachment. His grief for his sister had not faded, it had hardened into an unbending conviction that truth must be seized, not awaited. The proposal marked a shift, not only in policy but in atmosphere. From that day on, palace corridors carried a tension reminiscent of conquered cities, quiet, orderly, but trembling beneath the surface. Sam believed he was restoring control. In truth, he was training the city to fear him. The chamber chosen for the decisive council vote was the same hall where rulers of the Buyid administration had traditionally debated tax laws, water disputes, and military expenditures. It had always been a space for negotiating outcomes through argument, precedent, and persuasion. But on the day Sam al-Dawla convened his ministers and scholars, any illusion of free deliberation dissipated before the doors even closed. Daylamite guards, his most loyal forces, lined the walls with an unmistakable message. Their hands rested on the hilts of unsheathed blades. No one had been told why they were summoned under such conditions, though everyone suspected the reason. The decree drafted in recent days had circulated in whispers, a bureaucratic blueprint for enhanced inquiry in treason cases. Yet many believed it would be debated, perhaps softened, possibly rejected. That hope collapsed the moment the guards sealed the exits. Sam entered without ceremony, carrying a small bundle of scrolls. He did not sit. Instead, he stood at the center of the hall, unrolling the document containing the proposed decree. His voice echoed against the vaulted ceiling as he read each clause, measured, controlled, as though presenting agricultural data rather than authorizing coercive force. The scholars who remained after the earlier exodus kept their eyes lowered. Ministers shifted uneasily in their seats. When Sam finished, he placed the scroll on the central table. "This requires signatures," he said, his tone firm but devoid of anger. It was the clarity of his expectations, not their severity, that unnerved the room. A senior minister rose slowly, invoking the danger of altering legal norms under duress. He suggested postponement. Another scholar added that a decree of this magnitude required broad judicial consensus. Sam listened in silence, then gave a subtle nod to the guards. Two soldiers stepped forward, escorting the dissenting minister toward the exit. The minister asked where he was being taken, but no one answered. The door closed behind him with a dull finality. The hall fell silent. A scribe brought ink and parchment to the table. One by one, under the watchful gaze of armed soldiers, council members approached to sign the decree. Some hands trembled, others steadied themselves deliberately, choosing compliance as the only viable path. No one spoke. No objections were recorded. No amendments were proposed. Fear had dissolved the deliberative spirit that once defined the council. A visiting jurist from Basra hesitated as he reached for the reed pen. His pause lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough to draw the attention of the nearest guard, who rested a hand on the jurist's shoulder, a gesture gentle in execution but brutal in implication. The jurist signed. 3 more officials attempted subtle forms of resistance, delays, appeals, uneasy questions. Each was escorted out as quietly as the first. Their absence deepened the unspoken understanding that the decree would pass unanimously, regardless of personal conviction. By the time the final signature dried, the air felt drained of warmth. Sam rolled the scroll with careful precision and handed it to his chief scribe for safekeeping. He offered no triumphant declaration, no gesture of victory. He simply dismissed the council. But everyone understood that a threshold had been crossed. What began as a private impulse had now acquired the thin, brittle facade of law. When Sam announced a public trial for a nobleman accused of treason, the city stirred with nervous speculation. The accused, Abu Faraj ibn Lulu, belonged to a family known for opposing Sam's recent tax reforms, but no one had expected a charge of treason. The timing was unmistakable. The ink on the new decree had barely dried. Many understood this trial would serve a purpose beyond justice. The court was arranged in the palace courtyard, framed by tents to control attendance. Soldiers created narrow entry points, funneling citizens into orderly rows. Chroniclers later noted the atmosphere resembled not a judicial proceeding, but a demonstration of authority. People came quietly, fearful yet compelled to witness what the decree meant in practice. Abu Faraj was brought forward in chains. Though his clothes remained intact, his posture revealed that he had already endured long nights of interrogation. His gaze avoided the ruler's dais, settling instead on the ground, where he seemed to anchor himself against the weight of the accusations. Samsam presided over the trial with a composed expression. A Qadi read the formal charges, referencing intercepted letters allegedly planning a revolt. The letters were never displayed. Witnesses, anonymous for their protection, provided rehearsed statements. Their words lacked conviction, but the new decree eliminated the need for persuasive evidence. When the questioning began, Abu Faraj's voice cracked. He denied the charges, then faltered, then denied them again. His statements, inconsistent from exhaustion, were presented as proof of duplicity. The prosecutor invoked the decree, arguing that extraordinary measures had been necessary to extract clarity from a man who had attempted to obscure the truth. The crowd shifted uneasily. They recognized the implication. The nobleman's worn state was no accident. Several citizens attempted to leave, but guards blocked the pathways. Samsam wanted the city to witness the consequences of dissent. The silence was heavy, broken only by the prosecutor's steady recitations. When Abu Faraj was asked to confess publicly, he looked at the crowd, a sea of anxious faces, and seemed to understand that the trial's outcome had been determined long before he stepped into the courtyard. His voice trembled with resignation. He admitted to nothing, yet his pauses were interpreted as evasion. His pleadings were treated as defiance. Every word he spoke tightened the noose woven by the decree. The verdict was declared swiftly, guilt for endangering the stability of the realm. Sentencing was postponed to allow reflection, but everyone understood its nature. The crowd was escorted out slowly, ensuring all saw Abu Faraj collapse to his knees after the judgment. Chroniclers recorded that sight for generations, not as evidence of guilt, but as testament to the fear that now ruled the city. The trial achieved exactly what Samsam intended. It legitimized the decree through spectacle. It instructed the populace to equate silence with wisdom. It cautioned the bureaucracy that resistance would not only fail, it would be publicly crushed. It was never about truth. It was about teaching the city what their ruler was now willing to do. In the weeks following Abu Faraj's trial, Shiraz underwent a transformation so swift and so complete that even longtime residents struggled to recognize their own city. The bustling markets that once reverberated with lively bargaining now sounded muted, as though a heavy cloth had been draped over the entire urban landscape. Merchants began limiting conversation to essential exchanges. Weights, prices, greetings, anything more felt dangerous. Caravans approaching the city gates sensed the tension before entering. Guards inspected goods with unusual scrutiny, questioning drivers repeatedly about routes and cargo. Many traders chose alternative roads, avoiding Shiraz altogether. Those who entered did so quickly, eager to conduct business and depart before sunset. Households, once known for spirited evening gatherings, grew cautious. Families spoke in low tones, windows shuttered even in warm weather. Servants learned to tread lightly, avoiding discussions that might be misconstrued. Mothers warned children not to repeat anything they heard at home, even casual complaints. A single misinterpreted word now carried the weight of potential accusation. Soldiers, empowered by the new decree, turned watchfulness into routine. Minor disputes between patrols were reported immediately to superiors, not out of civic duty but self-preservation. Suspicion became an unspoken currency, traded to shield oneself from scrutiny. A soldier could climb in rank simply by appearing more vigilant than his peers. Night patrols expanded. Lanterns moved through alleys in steady patterns, punctuating the darkness like slow-moving stars. To the city's artisans and scholars, once accustomed to working late into the night, these patrols were reminders of the shrinking space for intellectual and cultural expression. Scribes, who once copied poetry, began instead to copy legal decrees. Calligraphers found more commissions for warning notices than for illuminated manuscripts. The libraries of Shiraz, celebrated for their rare volumes, grew emptier as scholars avoided gatherings that might attract unwanted questions. Discussions shifted from literature to survival. Many who had fled earlier now sent word urging colleagues to leave while possible. Some did. Many stayed, trapped by aging parents, debts, students, or hope that the fear would pass. Samsam al-Dawla mistook the city's suffocation for stability. Reports describing the silence of the markets and the absence of dissent reassured him. He interpreted the quiet as loyalty, not realizing that loyalty built on fear is as fragile as parchment exposed to flame. Inside the palace, the transformation was even more dramatic. Ministers submitted paperwork promptly, without objection. Guards saluted more crisply. Servants made themselves nearly invisible. But beneath the surface, distrust spread like an infection. Each official suspected the next. Each assumed that someone else was reporting private conversations. Even Samsam's closest advisors began holding their breath when he entered the room. Yet Samsam believed he had restored harmony. The stillness comforted him. He interpreted lowered voices as respect, not self-protection. What he could not see was that a city forced into whispering is one that has begun severing its emotional ties to its ruler. Whispers may not challenge authority, but they do not defend it either. The decree that had circulated as drafts, been forced into signatures, and tested through public spectacle, finally reached the moment of formal proclamation. Samsam chose the hours before dawn, when the city was still and shadows lingered longest. He summoned the remaining ministers and scholars to the central hall, the same chamber where dissent had been erased weeks earlier. This time, the gathering was smaller. Many officials had fled. Others had vanished under unclear circumstances. Guards lit oil lamps along the walls, casting long silhouettes that flickered with each shift of flame. The officials who entered kept their hands clasped, their eyes forward. None spoke more than a whisper. The scrape of sandals on stone echoed sharply in the subdued hall. Samsam stood at the front, holding the final scroll. His posture was rigid, his expression controlled. Chroniclers later wrote that he appeared neither triumphant nor regretful, merely hollow, as though the weight of the decree had already pressed the emotion out of him. He unrolled the parchment and began reading. Each clause was pronounced with steady precision, establishing coercive interrogation not as an emergency measure, but as a mandatory procedure in cases of treason. The language was clinical, devoid of cruelty, yet sharp enough to cleave centuries of jurisprudence. Ministers shifted uncomfortably as the implications unfolded line by line. When he finished, Samsam placed the scroll on a low table. "Your signatures," he said. His voice carried no threat, but the guards' rigid stances supplied the missing context. One by one, officials approached. The scene resembled a ritual more than legislation. Hands trembled as names were written, sealing compliance under the soft glow of the lamps. The silence grew heavier with each signature, thick enough to muffle the faint sounds of the waking city beyond the palace walls. A young jurist hesitated before signing, recognizing the decree's permanence. Samsam met his gaze, offering neither reassurance nor menace. The man's resolve broke. He bent his head and signed. When the final name was inked, Samsam lifted the scroll. For a moment, the hall felt suspended in time. He looked at the assembled officials, not as collaborators, but as necessary instruments in a process he believed essential for security. His face reflected exhaustion, not satisfaction. Some chroniclers noted that he seemed almost detached from his own actions, as though observing them from a distance. He announced the decree's enactment with a single sentence. No ceremony followed, no speeches. The guards opened the doors, allowing the officials to disperse into the dim corridors. They left silently, knowing the city they governed had changed irrevocably. As dawn light crept into the palace, the proclamation spread through the administration. Scribes copied the decree. Couriers prepared to carry it to provincial officials. Word drifted into the streets, carried by servants to marketplaces and workshops. The city absorbed the news with quiet dread. People remembered Abu Faraj's fate and understood that the decree solidified the logic of fear. Samsam retreated to his private chamber. Those close to him later remarked that he sat for a long time without speaking, staring at the sealed scroll. He had crossed a threshold from which he could not return. The law he had crafted with such determination would soon become the force that hollowed his authority. The aftermath of the decree spread faster than Samsam al-Dawla anticipated. Within days, messages from regional Buyid governors arrived, their language restrained but unmistakably critical. They warned that the decree threatened public trust, destabilized administrative order, and risked igniting unrest in territories already fragile from economic strain. While they did not openly challenge his authority, their tone carried a clear implication. They feared the consequences of being associated with a ruler seen as embracing coercion over justice. Rival branches of the Buyid family seized the moment. They framed Samsam's decree as evidence of erratic leadership, arguing that regional security depended on restoring traditional legal norms. Troops loyal to these factions began assembling, marching south toward Shiraz. Their movements were deliberate, calculated, and highly visible, meant as a message as much as a threat. Inside the palace, the atmosphere shifted again. Guards who once saluted Samsam with rigid precision now exchanged uneasy looks. Ministers arrived late to meetings, departing quickly with vague excuses. Some quietly relocated their families outside the city. Others began sending discreet messages to the approaching forces, signaling their willingness to align with whoever emerged victorious. Samsam noticed the changes but interpreted them through the lens of betrayal rather than consequence. He convened emergency councils, demanding reports on troop movements and potential conspiracies. Ministers offered half-answers, their fear of him now eclipsed by fear of the armies drawing closer. The chamber that had once echoed with forced compliance now felt hollow, its authority evaporating. As opposing forces neared the outskirts of Shiraz, desertions among Samsam's own troops accelerated. Dalamite guards, men who had enforced his decree, who had stood at his side during the council, now slipped away in small groups, abandoning their posts before dawn. Some left the city entirely. Others switched allegiance, offering their services to rival commanders. On the final night, the palace felt unnervingly quiet. Lamps burned low along the corridors, their flames wavering in drafts that slipped through unguarded doorways. Samsam walked alone through the halls, passing rooms once crowded with advisors, now emptied. The silence, which he had once misinterpreted as loyalty, now echoed with abandonment. Near sunrise, he entered the very hall where his decree had been forced into signatures. The scroll still rested on a table, sealed and formal, its authority intact, but its support collapsed. As he stared at it, footsteps sounded behind him, not soldiers, but the remaining ministers. Their faces were drawn, their posture hesitant. They informed him, with carefully measured words, that his rule had ended. The approaching forces were at the gates, the guards had laid down their weapons, and the city was prepared to accept a new authority. Samsam did not resist. Chroniclers describe him as eerily calm, almost resigned, as though he finally recognized that the fear he had cultivated had isolated him completely. He left the hall quietly, escorted by officials who only weeks earlier had feared to speak in his presence. By midday, the decree was nullified. The new administration proclaimed its reversal as one of its first acts, restoring the legal boundaries that had existed before Samsam's descent into coercion. The law he had fought so relentlessly to establish survived only a few weeks. But its cost, his authority, his city's trust, and his own legacy, endured far longer.